Hi, everyone. Welcome to Weekly Insights. I recently attended a virtual conference at Harvard, where some of the world's top researchers and clinicians on pathological narcissism and NPD presented their work. By far the most impactful presentation was given by Dr. Salman Akhtar, a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Dr. Akhtar is 78 years old and has had a truly prolific career, having authored, edited, or co-authored over 300 publications. But what was most impressive about his presentation wasn't his academic knowledge, but its unvarnished humanity. He spoke about many of the themes presented on this channel: the tragedy of pathological narcissism, the anxiety, the pressure, and the fear. Most touching, I think, was his characterization of the loneliness and isolation that he sees in his narcissistic patients. An isolation that stems from the pressure to be, as he put it, extraordinary. This pressure is ubiquitous in the treatment of pathological narcissism and NPD. It forms the basis of grandiose self-experience and idealized fantasies of the self. Individuals with these issues aren't allowed to be ordinary because, when they were young, being ordinary was associated with shame. Some were punished by disappointing or disapproving caregivers for failing to meet expectations. Some were ignored or neglected. Some were so highly praised for being extraordinary that anything less felt like loss of love. Whatever the specific situation, the lesson learned was that the self needs to be extraordinary to be any kind of a self at all. Dr. Akhtar really spent a lot of time on this concept, viewing it as the center of pathological narcissism. The neglect or punishment of the child's authentic, quote, ordinary self is the first tragedy. The second tragedy is what happens next. Many of these individuals grow up to actually be extraordinary in some respect. They're often smart, talented, good-looking, charismatic, or otherwise successful. Dr. Akhtar said, "Being extraordinary is actually a tragedy. No one wants to be around an extraordinary person. They're intimidated. They might look up to them, envy them, or want something from them, but to be extraordinary is to be alone. No one invites you to the neighborhood barbecue. No one feels comfortable letting down their guard." Now, this was a simple characterization, but it's one that resonates with my own experience as a specialist in this area of practice. Many of my patients feel isolated and alone. Many long to feel included in the ordinariness of everyday life, to feel a sense of belonging. But to do so would require letting go of the pressure, the need to be extraordinary. And in pathological narcissism and NPD, that need isn't typically limited to areas of life in which the person excels. Rather, the individual's identity is typically fused with the need to be continually perceived and validated as extraordinary. And this need is mutually exclusive with being accepted or included. It requires that the individual stand out as different, above, or other than everyone else. That's what it means to be extraordinary, not just in a limited set of skills or endeavors, but as an identity. There's a steep price to pay. The pursuit of extraordinariness in pathological narcissism and NPD isn't a goal that can be reached and enjoyed. It's an existential demand that must be continually met. In the absence of a sense of intrinsic worth and belonging, there's often a need to continually elicit proof of one's extraordinariness. Moments of validation don't last. They have to be continually recaptured before they slip away. And this brings us to the heart of today's discussion. Why do individuals with pathological narcissism and NPD struggle so profoundly with ordinariness? Why does the idea of being just a person, just one among many, feel so intolerable? For many, being ordinary doesn't just feel undesirable, it actually feels annihilating. Ordinary means invisible, interchangeable, and for those whose early experiences left them feeling unseen or dismissed or conditionally loved, ordinariness feels like non-existence. The fantasy of being extraordinary isn't merely about wanting admiration or success. It's motivated existentially. If the self was only ever recognized or valued when it was exceptional, then fading into the background is experienced not as a neutral state, but as a form of annihilation of self. And this is why narcissistic grandiosity isn't just about arrogance. It's a protective structure that's built to ensure that the self remains visible and significant, essentially intact. As Dr. Akhtar so poignantly described, extraordinariness is also profoundly lonely. The very thing that seems to promise acceptance of the self actually prevents it. Being admired is not the same as being loved. Being envied is not the same as being understood, and yet for many people with NPD, these are the closest substitutes available. The problem is that admiration, envy, and idealization are all inherently asymmetrical. They create distance rather than bridging it. And this is why many of my patients describe deep feelings of isolation, even when they're socially successful. They often feel that love is conditional, hinging on their continued performance of extraordinariness. They long for the kind of easy, mutual connection that other people seem to take for granted. But that connection requires a willingness to be seen as ordinary. And that's where the real conflict emerges. Letting go of the need to be extraordinary may feel like a kind of death. Healing requires mourning, not just for the idealized self-image, but for all the childhood wounds that made it necessary in the first place. And it requires tolerating the possibility that one might not be the special, ideal version of self that always seemed necessary to be any kind of a self at all. The ideal self was always an illusion, and even if it weren't, it could never actually be loved. It could be admired, or needed, or envied, or even celebrated, but it couldn't be accepted because it can never be real. And this is where healing begins, not in the dismantling of every ambition or the rejection of all exceptional qualities, but in the loosening of the need to feel extraordinary in order to feel real. It's in discovering that one's existence doesn't depend on standing apart from other people, but in allowing oneself to stand with them. Now, it goes without saying that this isn't a simple process. If you identify with some of the things that I'm saying here, try to be gentle and patient with yourself. Those are good skills to have, and they're also great practice at taking steps towards not having to be extraordinary. Okay, so that's it for today. The Weekly Insight series is a benefit for paid subscribers to the channel. For now, I'm making every even-numbered episode publicly available. But if you'd like to receive videos like these on a weekly basis, consider becoming a paid member. I appreciate your support, and it helps me to devote more time to this channel. Until next time, take good care.